How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here, and welcome back to our Tech Tree review series. And today's review will be looking at the all tier 10 tech tree lines within the Soviet tech tree. And of course, we'll be reviewing all of the tanks from tier 5 and upwards throughout all of the lines, giving you the full rundown as to what the vehicles are like, my opinion on them. Now, I'm not saying that it is the 100% overarching opinion that you should bow down to, etc, etc. It is just my experience of playing the various different tanks and how they're likely, in my opinion, gonna fare within the game. And so I can guide you as to which tanks I think are the best, which tanks are the worst, and which tanks maybe you'll kind of enjoy but might not be the most competitive vehicles in World of Tanks. So without further ado, let's get into it and start by looking at the tech tree. So of course, there are a ton of routes that you can go down in the Soviet tech tree line, and we're going to go down all of them. We'll give you the rundown of all tier 10 vehicles, and hopefully you'll enjoy having a look at them, seeing how they'll play, and it will be an interesting one for you. So without further ado, let's start with the light tanks for the Soviet line, and of course starting at tier 5 with the T-50. Now, the T-50, it's a vehicle that is kind of interesting because it's somewhat similar to the T-50-2. Of course, the T-50-2 is the tier 6 premium. Premiums won't be included within this review, so we'll do that at a later date. We'll review the entire premium tech tree, which is going to be a long one. But without further ado, this one, we have a load of upgrades that you can get, 4 of them, so not an absolute fortune worth of upgrades, but essentially what you've got here is a vehicle that has a really fast rate of fire gun. I mean, you can see it, 26 rate of fire with this vehicle when you're fully upgraded, dealing 70 damage per shell, and this is pretty much what you have with the T-50-2, and it's why this thing, you have to fire quite a bit of premium if you're coming up against tier 7s, which you will do in this vehicle since it is a tier 5 light tank, and typically you end up in lower tier games anyway within World of Tanks. So yeah, it's definitely difficult with the penetration values that you get on the standard gun. Remember, this is a Soviet tank, so you start off with 7 degrees of gun depression, and as you go through the tech tree line it gets worse and worse. You've also then got basically no hit points either because of course you're a light tank, but in general, from what I can remember of this vehicle, it was actually quite a fun one because essentially it's pretty fast, and if you know what you're doing, if you've got a good skill crew, which you may do if you've ground out some of the other tech tree lines, then I think you'll find this tank okay, but it's not outstanding. Now, the outstanding one for me, or the surprisingly amazing one, was the MT-25, and I mean that in not a meme way, because this vehicle, like, I guess for the most part is not overpowered or anything like that. No one's going to be telling anyone about how the MT-25 is outrageously good, but under the right situation and with the right main armament that you get with this 76mm, this thing can be really fun to use. And there's an argument that can be said for using the 57mm and just making sure that you fire some premium rounds with it to kind of make up for the penetration difference, because it's so much more accurate, there's a much better rate of fire, and so maybe you'll find it easier when you're out traversing people to use the smaller gun, which I don't necessarily disagree with, so there's an argument that can be made for both of them, but nonetheless it is a really fun one. The main thing about the MT-25 is that you can troll around the battlefield, you're just going around ruffle stomping people, just trying to drive around them. This thing is quite wide, which means the turning circle is maybe not as good as you would want from a light tank, but it definitely suffers from some terrain resistances, but they're not awful. Trust me, they're not absolutely terrible. Like, you're not going to have a problem with turning with this thing in most situations. It's not like the T-50-2 where you try and make a quick turn and suddenly you're on your side. This one does actually allow you to turn, but of course in doing that you don't get as quick of speeds when you're trying to make those turns, so it does slow down quite a bit as you try and make this, the turns, but nonetheless I think that this vehicle is more than adequate for most people at tier 6 for a light tank, and is really fun to play, but does require a few premium rounds if you're using the smaller gun, and if you're using the top gun you'll probably still need some premium rounds up against tier 8 heavy tanks and tier 8 medium tanks, and probably even tier 7 medium heavy tanks even, so there's that. But then you move on to a tank that is... I don't know. I did not like the LTG. I found it a little bit disappointing to play. I'm not saying it's awful. It's by no means terrible. But the thing that I found with this tank is it's very inflexible. It gets 5 degrees of gun depression, but you're basically on the floor. And because you're so low profile, like height-wise of the vehicle... If you have a look, like this is genuinely tiny in the game, which means that when you're trying to use gun depression on a hill, because you're so small but also really quite long compared to the height of the vehicle, it means that you end up not being able to get at any gun depression basically. Even though you have 5 degrees, it's not really like that in the game. So yeah, combine that with the terrible accuracy for a light tank that has a relatively low rate of fire. It's not like a super fast firing one. It is considerably higher than, you know, a heavy tank with 390 alpha, but for this kind of tank it's not particularly amazing. Obviously as you get fully upgraded, which you're going to want to do as quickly as possible, trust me, and then when you get there you'll be able to have a little bit more fun because the penetration gets a little better, but remember you're still going to be having to fire quite a bit of premium with these vehicles, and I mean that in no uncertain terms, because 144 penetration on the standard gun of this thing when you're in tier like 9 games, which you can come up against things like the Object 752 and stuff like that are a little bit tricky to pen. This vehicle just cannot stand up with 126 pen on the standard gun, and then when you're fully upgraded 140 I believe it is, somewhere in that region. So you do need the premium rounds, unfortunately, but it's just a case of like you will need them if you do want to play this vehicle. But remember, it's not that much of a grind to be able to get the LTTB, and it's actually all up from there. And so the LTTB is one of my favourite light tanks to play, not only because it's a pretty heavy light tank, but also the fact that it plays somewhat similar to the T50-2, which is one of my favourite tier 6 light tanks in the game because it's so quick and it's novel and it has a really fast rate of fire. The LTTB is kind of like the tier 8 equivalent, I would guess. Maybe not as kind of death by 1,000 cuts, I guess, but it is a really good tank overall. It has, of course, the main armament being 180 damage, and this maintains throughout, so you do get a top gun, which basically gets increased penetration and a better rate of fire and better accuracy, so it's effectively just an upgraded version of the stock gun. And as soon as you get that, it becomes really good to play. Of course, without the engine upgrade, it is sluggish as well to begin with, but as soon as you get the engine upgrade, it becomes so much better. And if you know how to use the spotting mechanics with this thing, concealment is actually okay, view range is pretty good, so you can kind of be a very versatile light tank, and with 2000 DPM as standard, it's a good one, and I would highly recommend you going down the kind of tier 10 light tanks all the way up to the T100 LT. And then from the LTTB, you can then get the T54 lightweight, and the T54 lightweight is a very good one for me. I have absolutely loved playing this vehicle. I play it as a super heavy light tank, and I don't mean that as in like a super heavy tank. I mean it as the light tank is really heavy for a light tank. It is a T54 hull that can go 70 kilometers an hour, and even when you use the engine boost, you can get that up to 79 kilometers an hour, and it weighs the same as a T54. So imagine ramming at 80 against a Batchat 12T or something like a I don't know, an RU251 or something like that. They just basically get decimated, and if you run the spool liner with it in a ramming setup, you can get an extra 50% more ramming damage, whilst also then using the commander perks, which reduce the amount of damage that you take from ramming and increase it by 20%. Yeah, I think it's controlled impact, I believe. So yeah, it's such a great tank. It's super, super fun. It has a high alpha damage as well. You've got 2 guns. The top gun obviously getting better penetration, but you start off with an okay one anyway, so there's no real problems there. Really, really did enjoy this tank. I highly recommend you get it. Try the ramming setup. Don't use it all of the time because it's not that effective in terms of maintaining a good competitive level, but trust me, when you get it right, when you come up against an enemy light tank that just doesn't know what day of the week it is, and alternatively even some tier like 7 heavies you can ram for a lot more damage than they'll be dealing to you, and pretty much medium tanks at the same tier you can ram as well, and anything lower tier than you usually. Don't go ramming VK 1001Ps or anything like that, or like super heavy tanks, like, you know, I mean, use a little bit of IQ before you ram something, but this thing is really, really fun to play, and I highly recommend it to everyone. And then once you finish the T54 lightweight, you get onto the T100 LT, which is probably the best light tank in the game for pure light tank playstyle, where you can just go in, where you're actively scouting, whilst also then using the concealment of this thing to be able to passive scout. And with the good rate of fire that the T100 LT gets, you're able to run rings around your opponents, just be a nuisance, and it's such a like a slim profile, much like the LTG, but with a much better kind of profile, and not that horrible bulky turret that basically has no armor. This thing can bounce a few rounds just because of the slope, but it's unlikely. But overall, vehicle is amazing. I really do enjoy playing this one, and of course you guys can always test it out. I'm very close to getting it on my main account. We're only 100,000 XP away, so a little bit of a grind, but as soon as we do that, we can get that unlocked as well. But other than that, let's jump down all the way back down to tier 5 with the T34, leading on to all of the medium tanks, or at least some of the medium tanks, in the T62A and the Object 140. But anyway, starting off with the T34, there are 2 tanks, or alternatively, there are 3 vehicles that can come off of this, that being the MT25, the T3485, and the A43. For simplicity, what we'll do is we'll just run down an entire tank line to the 2 tier 10s, and then we'll come back to the tier 6 A43, and we'll do that throughout the line if there's this sort of scenario, which, trust me, there is within the Soviet tech tree. But anyway, the T34, what we have with this vehicle is a really, really solid vehicle. It is super, super good. It has pretty much everything that you'll need, especially if you know how to play medium tanks. Remember, it doesn't really have that much armor, but the main armament of this thing has fantastic damage per minute, and it means that against a lot of the other heavy tanks and stuff, if you know that they've fired, or maybe they've hit you for the amount of damage that they've done, you can absolutely rinse them of all of the hit points on their vehicle. It's fairly fast. It can go 56 top speed. Turret armor, as we say, not particularly great, but view range is really, really good as well for a medium. And generally, I think this tank is a very, very good one. You won't really have any problems. And then you lead on to quite possibly the best tier for tier medium tank in the tech tree line, or at least in this tech tree line, which is the T3485. Now, this is because the T3485 gets this top gun, the 85mm, and it is a outstanding round, or outstanding main armament, because it gets 180 alpha, I believe. It's also super, super quick firing. Like, the DPM of this tank, when fully upgraded with everything in it, is really, really good. And so you're able to just tear apart opponents. It's got great view range. It's got decent mobility, you're able to move, you've got just a ton of things that this vehicle can do, and there's nothing that really limits you in this to having these like outrageous games. And I really did find this vehicle to be one of the best mediums in the game, tier for tier. So, you know, compare that to the other vehicles at the same kind of tier. It's one of the better ones, if not the best. Of course, you can compare it to things like the HMH T3485 M, which is like the premium version. There's a T3485M. There's also a T3488, which is the 88mm. It gets 240 alpha, and it's probably the better of it because it's a premium, of course. But nonetheless, a really, really solid performance, and I think you will love this vehicle if you go towards it. Then you kind of move on to the T34 or the T43 even. Yeah, I don't think the same can be said for this vehicle. It's a little bit lackluster when you get it because it's a lot bigger, remember. It does get the same sort of characteristics, and when you're fully upgraded you do get this 85mm, but it's just not quite there. Now you can pick the 122, but it's basically a dirt gun, so you don't want that. Trust me, don't use the 122, just use the standard one all the way up to the top gun of this thing, and it's pretty much the same sort of tank but a tier higher, and just doesn't quite perform as well. It gets a little bit more hit points, obviously more penetration, slightly better vision range, but tier for tier it's just blatantly worse than the previous vehicle. And of course you are at that tier up, so you can come up against things like the T10, things like the 705, the 257, who will just rip you in half. So yeah, this medium tank probably not the best one. Then you move on to the T44, which is the tier 8 vehicle in the medium tank line, and this one is essentially this is where the armor starts to come and kick in, where you no longer just have auto pen armor, and it means that you can basically angle with these things. You can play them a bit more like brawlers, which you'll find out as with all of the Soviet mediums as you get in the higher tiers. They kind of rely on this brawler playstyle where you kind of poking out from corners, dealing your damage, and essentially just being a nuisance to opponents. And that is what this tank really does well. It's why I actually went and 2-marked it. Could probably 3-mark it now if I wanted to, but I don't really have any intention to because it's not that overpowered. And I mean, from my own statement, I don't think it's going to be like outrageously good, but I mean, it was a fun one to play. It certainly wasn't like a super hard grind. And if you've played anything like the Motherland or the T44 100, I think there's a few others, but basically the same sort of tank. Really, really solid performer, and much like the mediums before it, it's not terrible, but it's not outrageously good. We then lead on to the T54, which is basically an upgraded armor version of the T44. Gets a much more solid gun. It performs way better in my opinion. You also get the 320 Alpha, I believe, on the top packages of this gun. One of the guns is basically a premium ammo spam gun. It did get buffed recently, so it's a little bit more usable, and I think the stock grind of this thing got upgraded, so it's not as bad. When you're fully upgraded, it is a perfect kind of brawling medium tank, as we've said before, with the Soviet tech tree lines, and I think for the most part no one's going to really complain a whole lot when playing the T54, other than maybe your bank account when playing it because of the premium that you do have to use if you want to use the better of the two guns. I think the D54 was the one that everyone used off the top of my head, but you guys can obviously verify that and decide upon which one you want. I think the changes were that you get reduced penetration on one, but then the gun statistics are better, which means the damage per minute and stuff was slightly better, but obviously you don't get the pen. But yeah, just check that out yourself, and you can do that by just literally click it on the package, seeing what's different, and yeah, make your own mind up as to that. And then we move on to the two tier 10 vehicles, tier 10 mediums, that is, the Object 140 and the T62A, which are both really, really interesting vehicles, mainly because they're more of the DPM aspect of the medium tanks in World of Tanks, and more like brawling mediums as well. So they have a little bit of armor, but they're not outrageously armored. They have the good DPM, but not insanely good DPM. They're kind of like the all-round, think of like a Centurion Action X, but for the Soviet tech tree line. The armor isn't overpowered, the kind of gun isn't overpowered, the like view range isn't overpowered. Nothing is like outrageously, outlandishly amazing about these vehicles, but they're really, really good in just pretty much everything. So that's kind of where they become good. And actually recently what happened is the 140 became basically the tank that you want. I think the T62A used to have way better speed and it had much better armor, but recently they went ahead and actually buffed the armor model of the 140. They also made the damage per minute of the 140 better, so effectively the 140 just has literally better in every single way except from hit points and the top speed limit. So if you want to buy a vehicle, I would highly recommend you get the 140 over the T62A now, because there was just basically no reason for you to actually play the 140 anymore, I believe, off the top of my head. So yeah, it's one of those things where Wargaming went above and beyond and just buffed one way better than the other, so you no longer want to play the other. So yeah, it's interesting. You can see the view range is slightly better. Obviously that is down to the fact that of equipment. Oh no, it's not actually. They've both not got a commander in, so these are the pure differences, since they both have this same equipment bar vents on, I believe. But yeah, essentially I believe the 140 is the better option at the moment, so you can decide upon that yourself. There's not a whole lot of difference, like if you pick one over the other. To be honest with you, I just picked the one that I think looks the best, which is the T62A. So yeah, that's kind of how I picked my tank, and of course you can do the same depending on how you like to play the game. But neither one is terrible. They're both going to be super good performers. But jumping all the way back down to tier 6, we have the A43, which is a vehicle that I really should repurchase. And I'll do that now on the game. I won't put stuff in it, but essentially what this vehicle has is a variety of different things that you can do with it. Essentially what you've got to do with this vehicle is much like the T34. It's not really got much of anything. It's basically like a fast firing version of the T34-85, but doesn't get the turret armor. And yeah, you kind of rely upon just smashing out a decent amount of damage. But overall, I think that a lot of people like this vehicle. It's 55 kilometers an hour top speed, and I think is a very solid performer for most people. And then you move on to the A44, which is the rear mounted version. This is where the rear mounted turret comes in, by which I mean the turret is mounted at the back of the vehicle, the rear of the vehicle. I'm sure most of you know that at this point, but for those of you that don't, essentially this vehicle plays like well, supposedly you can pull around corners, bounce around and get on with your day, but remember the side armor is not very good. You've got about 60 mil of side armor, and as soon as you expose that a little bit too much, you get penned, and as soon as you expose the turret armor, be it this is the stock turret, as soon as you get fully upgraded, it's not as bad. But yeah, people will go for the cupolas of this vehicle. This is the stock version though. Please be careful when looking at this vehicle, because it does get the upgraded turret, which is slightly better. The cupola gets smaller, I believe, but most people will still aim for the cupola, and they can pen the turret anyway most of the time. And if you expose any of that frontal hull armor that you can see literally here with the yellow and red bar, green bars, not red. If you literally hit any of those, you'll get penned in this vehicle. So yeah, there's not much you can really do about that, other than the fact of using the DPM of this tank, which I believe is actually very, very good for a tier 7 medium tank, 2220 basically, and that is stock. So yeah, I think it gets slightly better as you go through, and so it's not just a tank you look at and go, it's an A44, I'll just completely rinse it, because when you get fully upgraded you can get this 300 alpha damage gun, but not sure that I would go with it just purely based on the accuracy. But looking now, maybe I would, because the standard accuracy of the 76mm is 0.41, which is awful. So yeah, maybe I would go with the Top Gun and just use all of the accuracy perks and equipment to reduce it as much as possible. Either way, the A44 then leads on to the 416, which off the top of my head, it's not very good. I mean, you do get an upgraded turret, which helps massively, because the turret armor of the stock version, like you're seeing here, is useless. Absolutely useless. Everyone will pen you. There is no armor on this vehicle when stock. When you get the upgraded turret, slightly better, but not outlandishly better. You do get more hit points and stuff like that, but ultimately, yeah, the tank is pretty much the same. And then when you fully upgrade, you get the same rate of fire, but more alpha, so essentially more damage per minute potential and more penetration, so just better in general. So always use the Top Gun of this vehicle. And yeah, a really, really okay vehicle. And by okay, I mean super bang average. Like, there is nothing special about this vehicle in general. It can be a little bit of a clubber if you kind of know how to side scrape and stuff. but I think for like the majority of players, you're probably not going to enjoy this tank a whole lot. But as soon as you get to the tier 9 vehicle, which is where it all starts becoming a little bit better, the Object 430 version 2, and this is because this tank has a very lethal weapon on it, and that is this Top Gun 320 Alpha, but a super low reload, which means you can kick out the damage super quickly with high penetration and high accuracy, or low accuracy. You know what I mean. It's more accurate, it's got more damage, it basically kicks out that damage faster, and it actually gets a little bit of armor on the turret as well as on the hull armor. You're not going to bounce an insane amount, but you know, if people auto aim, it can actually bounce because it auto aims on the central bit of the hull armor, which is pretty well angled. So you can bounce a few rounds. Side armor is trash, so you'll get absolutely trashed on from the side. But other than that, yeah, I think this vehicle is actually pretty good. And then that leads on to the 3 tier 10 mediums, the Object 430, the K91 and the Object 430U, all of which are unique in their own playstyle, I guess, except maybe the 430. But the 430 is essentially imagine a 140 or T62A that has got its armor buffed, so it bounces a few more rounds. It sacrifices gun statistics to be able to do so you don't have quite as accurate of a gun. You also don't have quite as damage per minute of the gun, but I think overall it's not awful, but it's just a bit of a mishmash, and you sacrifice a bit for the armor, but doesn't really gain a whole lot because no one really struggles to pen a 430, even though it does get better armor than most. I mean, maybe some people who might auto aim this vehicle, but yeah, overall I don't think anyone's really bouncing off of it. And then we lead on to the K91, the K91 being the DPM king of the Soviet medium tanks, and that is because this vehicle is the rear-mounted version of the Object 430-2, so it's like the tier 10 version of this vehicle, and as such, when it's fully kitted out, when you've got all of the DPM perks, you're probably looking at about 3,500 DPM, something in that region, which is pretty good for a tier 10 medium. Nothing outlandishly amazing, but it is kind of what this tank is aimed for. The accuracy is 0.33, so really good. 9 degrees of gun depression, 55 kilometers an hour, has the rear mounted turret. The turret armor is, I want to say it's okay, but it's just not. Most people will pen you through the turret even when side scraping, so as soon as you expose the side, most people may not bounce, may not hit you, but if you expose the side too much to the point where they hit that kind of angled plate, you can probably see it better from this view, the yellow bar on the sides, because it's sloped. As soon as you start doing this, if you let the opponent have any shot into that yellow bar on the right and the left hand side of this vehicle, you get penned. So how can you use the rear mounted turret when you can't expose any of the front of the vehicle, bearing in mind that the gun will always be positioned over that point unless you overexpose the side armor, at which point they'll just pen you in the side. So you have to try and bait them by only exposing this much, and then when they fire, go behind cover, you then have to pull out and somehow hit them. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird, flawed design, in my opinion. But yeah, it's usable. It's by no means the best medium, and you'd probably be better off playing something like the T62A, which doesn't sacrifice so much. And yeah, just in general, is a bit better of a tank. But other than that, K91 can be used pretty well. It's not OP. It's okay. Then you get the 430U, which is like imagine the big brother that just has been on a bit of the juice and just gets beefed up massively. And you can see here the turret armor is pretty good. The hull armor is really effective. There is no negative for really side scraping in this vehicle, and so you can bounce quite a few rounds off the side. You also get spaced armor on the sides, and yeah, the turret armor, as we've already said, is really good. The main armament of the vehicle is completely different to all of the rest of them because it gets 440 alpha as opposed to the 320 that all of the rest of them get. It gets 5.13 rate of fire, so you're kicking out 2,300 DPM, so you sacrifice nearly 500 damage per minute with this vehicle over the others. in general. So there's something to be said for that, but the amount of effective armor that this vehicle gets for actually being upgraded, and having the 440 Alpha enables this thing to be a bit of a monster. And when it was first introduced, it was kind of the next addition in power creep, but we all know how power creep's been going, and it's been continuously in the game. So maybe this vehicle isn't as good as it once was when it was originally in the game, but it is still a very, very top performer of the medium tanks in the game if used correctly, and has the right sort of player behind it, as I'm sure you probably can be with this vehicle if you take in a few of the tips, and of course apply your own kind of gameplay style to it. I'm sure you can make it work, and it's definitely one that can work for you. But other than that, we jump back all the way to tier 5 on the heavy tank route. So this is the heavy tank portion, I would assume. And essentially what we have here is a few different lines that you can go down. Now, I'll give you a brief overview as to the lines that will be taken out. We've got the 705A, the IS-7, the 277 and the IS-4, all of which are slightly different in their own right, and they're all pretty novel and unique considering that they are all Soviet tier 10 heavies, and the lines leading up to them are kind of reflective of that. So we start off either way with the KV-1S and the KV-1. We'll start with the KV-1 and move down that tech tree line, then we'll go back to the KV-1S and then kind of move down that line. So either way, KV-1, it is the kind of iconic vehicle at tier 5, and that is because it's very, very strong. The armor model of the vehicle is really good. It's slightly mobile, nothing too spectacular. It's not like a mouse or anything, but it can move forward a little bit. 34 kilometers an hour top speed, 500 horsepower. You know, you're going to be able to shift around a little bit. You've also then got this top gun, and you've also got a range of guns that you can use with this thing. So you can use the fast firing kind of almost OP pay to win gun where you can get 85 damage and pay for the premium rounds, which get much better premium pen, which also then can mean this tank has like 2000 DPM. But either way, you know, you can make up your own mind as to which one you want to use. But I mean, probably the easier one for people to use is the 85mm. And you can just use it as you would expect with a vehicle like this. Or, alternatively, you can use a Heat 122 and hope that the tank round actually hits where you're aiming with 0.57 accuracy, so it's not particularly great. But trust me, when you've fully upgraded this vehicle, when you have the engine, the top engine, and you're kind of using it in the playstyle that you want, whether you're using the Heat 122mm, whether you're using the 85mm, or whether you're all the way back down with the 57mm, it will work, and it is really, really good. At this tier, the armor model is also very, very good for a tier 5 heavy. A lot of people will bounce off of you if you angle towards them, especially as they are new players generally down at these lower tiers, but we all know that there's some seal clubbers out there probably playing the captured KV-1 and stuff like that. But regardless, it's so much fun, and I did enjoy playing the KV-1 entirely. And then, of course, there are two tanks that come off of this. We will actually cover the KV-2 as it's a bit more of a novel one, because it leads on to the artillery line, which we won't cover until later on. But the KV-2 is essentially a vehicle that has the derp gun, and this is the King Derp, I would say. It has this weird, very, very iconic turret, which you can see. This is a real-life tank, I believe, as well, when it was created. I'm sure someone in the comment section can highlight some more about the historical uses of the KV-2, but essentially it's this 152mm cannon which deals 700 alpha damage, bearing in mind that most hit points or most vehicles at this tier have about 800 hit points as a heavy tank, remember, and as medium tanks about 700 or less, which means you can basically one-shot people at this tier. And if you are using the HE rounds that this vehicle gets, which most people will because they get 86mm of penetration, which is more than enough to go through mediums and stuff like that, you can deal 910 damage in one singular shot, which is more than most hit points at the same tier. You can see here on a similar vehicle, the Object 244 has 880, the KV85 has 870. Yeah, basically you're a bit of a clubber in the KV2, and so it's a really, really fun one to play, but it's not overpowered in any way, shape or form, I don't think, other than being able to one-shot things. Other than that, it's pretty poor in most regards. The speed is terrible, the accuracy is terrible, the rate of fire is awful, the damage per minute is like... It's not very effective because it's very hard to pen things because of the accuracy, so effective DPM is just awful. You don't have any camo, you don't have any view range. Yeah, it's difficult, but it's definitely fun, and that is what World of Tanks should be. You shouldn't always be trying to get the most competitive tank. Sometimes it's about actually enjoying the game, and the KV2 will do that, so I highly recommend you go down that line. But regardless, back to the heavy tanks, and that is the T150, which is the actual kind of heavy tank equivalent, not the novel and unique one at this tier. And the T150 is a vehicle that at the tier it is at has actually very, very solid armor. This is the armored version, I guess, at this tier compared to the KV85. But essentially the T150 has this kind of more armoured version. At the start it has this awful turret which can basically be penned by everyone, so just be aware that the turret armour as stock is awful. Stock is the term used for if the vehicle hasn't been upgraded to the top version, because mostly you'll be spending your time with the top version because the grind to get the next vehicle is always the longest bit usually. So when you're fully upgraded, this tank is actually very, very good, and it gets the 107mm, which I believe has like 350 alpha or something in that region. Or you can use the derp gun to begin with the heat ammo, but of course this will cost you a ton of money, and especially if you don't have premium time or you haven't already played the game for any length of time to earn a load of credits like I have, then yeah, you're gonna not enjoy your life when playing the T150 to begin with. But as soon as you get that turret, the engine and the top gun, it's amazing, and a very, very solid heavy tank. Then we move on to the KV3. The KV3, I actually enjoyed this tank, but I'm not sure that it is because it's good, I think. But essentially the KV3, it's one of those vehicles that's super slow. It has a little bit of armor to the point where you might be able to bounce a few, but it's not outrageously good. People with premium ammo will just pen you regardless of how you're angling, etc. So it's disappointing in that regard. Even if you do everything exactly right, they'll just basically load premium and pen you. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame. But the alpha damage 390, it works very, very well, and when you're fully upgraded, it's not as slow as I thought it would be, but it's nothing speedy. 35.2 kilometers an hour. Yeah, it's not particularly the greatest, but remember, I am using the mobility, which I highly recommend you do just to get a bit of better speed, so you can get forward a bit better, and this vehicle kind of will do that. But ultimately, play it more like a very, very heavily slow version of a medium tank, and you might just end up not hating yourself when playing it. But yeah, it's not great, I don't think, and most people don't really enjoy the KV3 just because of its slowness and inflexibility. Then you move on to the KV4, which is basically the same tank but a tier higher, and relies upon, yet again, its armor model. It's slow as anything, and it also has the similar sort of gun, 320 alpha, or you can go with the other vehicle gun, which has 390 alpha, both of which are pretty good. Very, very reliable guns, so you don't really have to worry about those. Turret armor when stock is awful, so you want to get fully upgraded, trust me, with the standard turret to be able to get the one that's currently on this vehicle. So you can see it here, and as soon as you do that, this tank actually can bounce quite a few. I was surprised, considering how easy I find these to pen. As soon as people realize that, you know, you can pen that big, huge cupola on the top of the vehicle, you can pen that lower plate of this vehicle, you can pen that kind of upper hull armor as well, if you've just basically got high penetration rounds, and the side armor, as soon as you get around that, you can pen it so easily. So I just think if anyone has any real brainy or any knowledge of World of Tanks, this tank just sucks. Because they'll just pen you every single time and there's nothing you can do, and the damage per minute doesn't warrant the kind of lack of armor that will occur when someone knows what they're doing in the game. So yeah, I find it a little bit tedious, but I still enjoy the tank for what it is. It is a super heavy. Armor doesn't usually work in World of Tanks, so yeah, other than that, you can enjoy it. I'm sure people enjoy this tank, but for me, it's just not how I like to play the game, but I'm sure you can make it work. Other than that, it leads on to the ST1 even, sorry. The ST1 is the tank that I feel like is actually pretty good. I mean, stock, it's awful, because as with all of the Tech Tree line, the stock turret is useless, and you'll get penned by it, basically, by everyone if they realise you've got the stock turret, which, to be honest with you, in nowadays, people just don't know about vehicles, I feel like. So, yeah, you basically can be penned in the turret with the first gun, or the stock turret, and as soon as you get it fully upgraded, it becomes a much better one. The cupolas of the stock tank are very, very easy to hit. The fully upgraded version, not so much. You can see the stock turret here. It also gets that bar on the top of the tank, which is basically paper. So it's got 30mm of armor. So anything that has a bigger gun than 100mm essentially, or 90mm and above, so 91 plus, will basically be able to pen you through the top of the vehicle. I don't know if the overmatch mechanic works on console like it does on PC, but it's a similar sort of story, whereby if you have a big enough gun firing up against this thing, you'll just pen the roof, but when you get it fully upgraded, that is not capable. Well, it's just not possible. And then the armor, you got that big lower plate which gets penned, and also people will pen the upper plate regardless, so yeah, it can be a little bit painful to say the least, but I do think the STI has its place, and it kind of gets you up in the realms of kind of understanding how the top tier vehicle that leads on from this is going to play within the game, and that is the IS-4, which is the kind of a tank that I think is actually really underrated within the game. It's got 440 alpha, kicks out the damage pretty well. The armor model is really, really good for what it is. It's relatively fast as well, so you can get up to top speed pretty well. I think it's super, super good in the game, and every single IS-4 player that I hear about actually really likes this vehicle. So that has to be said for something. Not a lot of the times do you hear that this vehicle is, or a vehicle is good from people that play it. Trust me, even people playing things like the Turan say it's rubbish. So hearing that the IS-4 is actually good from people that play the IS-4 is, yeah, it's quite good. So I think this vehicle, for the most part, is a good one. I know that people will pen the cheeks of this thing if they've got high enough penetration, but then again, you're looking at kind of high alpha or high penetration tank destroyers and stuff like that. You've also got the cupola people can hit, but it's quite small, so it's not really going to be a problem. From above, this tank can be penned super easily. Artillery love the IS-4 from above, but the side armors really, really troll as well, because if we have a look in the actual model, you've got all of these boxes that are on the side, they count as spaced armor, and you got this log that was on the side, and at one point Wargaming messed up with the IS-4 to the point where the log was actually a hitbox, and it only had like 10mm of armor, so basically everyone could pen the IS-4 through the log. So yeah, it was when they messed up, but yeah, it made the IS-4 unusable from pretty much every single standpoint, unless you kind of side scraped off this corner and avoided showing your log at all. So yeah, that was a funny point in World of Tanks, but there you go. The IS-4, a very, very solid performer, and I think a very good heavy tank. Now jumping all the way back to the KV-85, which is the other, let's jump back to the KV-1S even, and I've actually got this vehicle. A KV-1S, when fully upgraded, is actually a very, very solid performer. I don't know if I have actually fully upgraded here, but essentially we've got that 122mm howitzer that we've been banging on about, where you have to fire heat rounds to be able to make it work. You can see I am loading the heat rounds in this thing, because 61 penetration is just not enough for most tanks that you'll be facing. So you get reduced damage, but you do get the 140 penetration, which basically means you can pen anything at the tier. So you essentially two-shot anything at tier 6, which is nice. But ultimately, if I wanted to be the most competitive, I would use the 85mm on this thing to just be more consistent. But it's all about the derp with this. You do get the armor, like I said, with the T150, but slightly less so because you get kind of like the KV1 armor. Yeah, it's an okay one, but I think the KV1 in general is the better of the two. Then you move on to the KV85, which was a really OP vehicle back in the day. I believe it was a tier 5, then it got moved to tier 6, or it was at tier 5 or at tier 6, then it got moved to tier 5 and then back up to tier 6. I think it was the first way round where it was a tier 5 then to tier 6. But essentially, this vehicle has the alpha damage and it's a lot more consistent. So when you fully upgraded in this thing, you actually do get accuracy and you don't have to fire heat, which reduces your alpha damage. So you got 390mm or 390 hit points with 175mm of penetration at tier 6. It's very, very consistent. There's not a lot more to be said about the vehicle. It's a solid performer. It gets you in the kind of vision of what this tank line is going to be like when you do decide to actually grind out to the tier 10s. And I think you'll find this tank absolutely fine to play. Then, of course, as you move through, you get the tier 7s from the heavy tank line, which are the IS and the KV-13. The KV-13 is kind of like a medium version. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially the turret armor is trash on this tank, so everyone pens it in the turret rather than shooting the hull armor, which is kind of rounded and a bit of annoying to pen for most people. But yeah, generally it's a good tank. I think it has like the fast fire rate of fire gun, but other than that, you've got the IS, which is the original kind of tier 7 heavy tank, and I actually 3 marked this apparently. But yeah, anyway, the IS is a tank that basically relies upon you getting forward and using the alpha damage. You have to kind of be aggressive, or you could alternatively use the 250 alpha damage gun, which get better accuracy, but at this point in World of Tanks console, I would use the higher alpha damage in these sort of tanks because the armor model definitely doesn't work, because you basically, imagine like a Tiger but the Soviet version, you basically get penned by everyone, so you have to make the shells that you fire really, really count, and that's kind of what this 390 alpha damage will do. You also haven't got the worst view range in this thing, so if you load it up with the coated optics, I wouldn't necessarily disrecommend it. You've then also got the traction system I use just to get a bit more speed. Alternatively, can use improved ventilation if you want, but those are kind of the perk options or the equipment options I'd use. Really, really good tank. I think very, very consistent. Is it a overall very heavy tank where you will bounce a load of rounds? No. The turret armor might be able to a little bit if they hit the actual turret as opposed to that big cupola, which is a weak point. And if you don't get set on fire from people hitting you in the gas tanks at the back, then yeah, I mean, it could be an outstanding tank, but it probably isn't in today's meta on World of Tanks. But moving on from the IS, you then lead on to the ISM, or the what was the other? The IS-3, sorry. So either way, the vehicles that lead on from this are the ISM, and we'll go down that route first. The ISM is, of course, a vehicle that has basically a similar sort of turret. You do get an upgraded turret, and that is what the ISBM tank. When you first have the original tank, I think you get the IS turret, which is not particularly amazing. So when you have the IS turret, the ISM is without any real going into too much depth, it's trash, the turret on the standard version. When you get the upgraded turret, which takes a little bit of XP, it becomes usable, and then when you get the top gun, it becomes even more usable. So it's one of those where it's like you have to bash your head against a brick wall in quite a few games to be able to get fully upgraded, but once you do, yay. That's basically what the ISM is, and I'm sure you guys probably know what the pain is like if you've ground out to the Object 705A And then you leave it on to the Object 705, which is the Tier 9. This tank is actually pretty good. Once again, as with pretty much all of the Soviet heavies, you need the fully upgraded turret to make this thing work, and when you do that, it becomes pretty good. Yeah, it's basically one of those, and it plays very much similar to the ISM. It's a rear mounted tank, so you want to be side scraping with these vehicles to avoid taking some shells and then poking around the corners. Yeah, it's a solid performer, and with the upgraded gun, you do get I believe 440 alpha instead of the 390, so a little bit more alpha. You might even got 490 alpha in general, but yeah, overall good gun. And then you lead on to the 705A, and the 705A is the big daddy, I suppose, of World of Tanks, and this gets the 650 alpha damage gun, which is a weird one. There's not very many tanks with the 650. I believe in general it might only be the this tank, and also maybe the what's it called, the Object 268 version 4, I believe, gets 650. There may be a few more. If I've got that wrong, make sure to leave it in the comment section. I'm sure you guys will help each other out. But essentially, I can give you the rundown. This vehicle relies upon the turret armor. It's got very, very good turret armor. Basically, nothing can pen it. There are some small cupolas, but even them are really, really good. The hull armor is actually pretty good as well. It's just that lower plate. Essentially, when someone sees the lower plate, they'll pen you every single time. If you avoid showing the lower plate, they basically will struggle for the most part, unless they're a high penetration round tank, which is pretty much tier 10s with premium ammo, can pen you in the upper plate. So it's kind of disappointing, and if you try to side scrape, you do give away that yellow proportion more so than the orange on the upper plate. So the upper plate being the central bit of the tank, you know, the hull armor, which is essentially the lower half of the tank, the yellow bit on this side, and then the yellow bit on that side. As soon as you angle like this, they can pen it because it becomes easier to hit. So yeah, not particularly great, but there you go. I think the 705 is a solid performer. Is it outrageously good? No, kind of lacks the forward force pushing power just because of the mobility and inflexibility, because I think it only gets 5 degrees of gun depression, so yeah, it can be a little bit painful, but 0.33 accuracy makes it a lot better to play. Anyway, moving back into the game, of course, you could either choose the ISM or you could choose the IS-3. Now, the IS-3 is the tank I would rather play at tier 8 for heavy tanks from the Soviet nation, and that's because it's actually a solid performer. We only one marked it, surprisingly. I was surprised I didn't actually go for the third mark, but apparently since I've actually played the vehicle, they've got a new gun. So this is a gun that I didn't actually have, I believe, when I first played the vehicle. But yeah, it's essentially 390 alpha. Turret armor is good, except when it's stock. It seems like that was Wargaming's meta. These tanks are all very old, whereby tanks had the stock grind was a little bit painful, and that's pretty much the Soviet tech tree, to be honest with you. But essentially, this vehicle has this pike nose. This is a very common Soviet tank, heavy tank kind of thing, but basically, as soon as you start moving your tank from the opponent like this, they can pen you easier in the nearest side, that angled bit. And then if you move the other side, they'll pen you in the other upper plate as well. And then the big lower plate as well can be penned. The turret armor, it holds up when fully upgraded. The stock tank, as you can see, that big green strip on the top can be penned from the front as well, especially if tanks are taller than you, which they can be because this isn't the tallest vehicle in the game. But yeah, as stock, but when fully upgraded, that pretty much kind of negates that whole thing. Side armor, you can side scrape with this vehicle, except from exposing this kind of pike nose, as we talked about. So you just want to give them the side, so they shoot you in the side and then don't pen, and then you pull around and deal damage to them. But yeah, other than that, very, very solid. Tier 8 heavy, probably less good. I don't even know if that makes sense, but it's not as good as it used to be. But one tank that is as good as it used to be is the Object 257, and this is a vehicle that is... it's basically idiot-proof, is my idea of this tank. It is a tank that is genuinely better if you sit side on. And I mean that with literally it is better if you sit side on to the majority of players that maybe don't know the most about World of Tanks. And that is because they always aim for the underside or near the tracks, which basically cannot be done with this vehicle because you cannot pen and track this tank basically, which is, I mean, it's so annoying, but yeah, you basically can't pen and track this vehicle. What you can do though is you can hit that upper bit of the vehicle, but it's actually very well angled, so it can be a little bit of a pain to pen it from the side. But what I tend to do is if someone is side on, I'll just move slightly further towards the front of their vehicle to be able to pen the angled pike nose, and that is really how you take this vehicle out. If they're from the front, you can pen the lower plate of this thing, but remember, premium ammunition is your best friend when coming up against this vehicle, and you can pen the right hand side and left hand side if they angle, and if they're centrally on, you can hit that big diamond shaped area on the lower bit. There is some cupolas that you can pen on this tank, but they kind of get negated with the top turret, I believe, but there are still cupolas on that even. And then, yeah, your best friend is the back of the tank if possible. But obviously, you guys know that all of the weak points now basically of this vehicle from the front and side. But there you go. It's a very, very annoying tank to come up against. And it gets, as with the previous 390 alpha, up until the Top Gun, where you get the 440 alpha damage, 122mm with very good accuracy for 440 damage. Yeah, really, really good tank, and of course it leads on to both the IS-7 and the Object 277. These tanks, these are good. I love the IS-7, I love the Object 277, both are fantastic in their own right, and these are my favourite heavy tanks in the Soviet Tech Tree line. Of course, I need to get the IS-4 to fully appreciate that this is more of the heavy aspect of the Soviet line, but yeah, IS-7 and the 277. We'll start off with the IS-7. So IS-7, yes, it does say 72 kilometers an hour on its max speed. It can get up to 72 kilometers an hour. Does it consistently do that? No, because the power to weight ratio of this vehicle is not particularly amazing, which means that it takes a while to get up to top speed, and pretty much to be able to hit the top speed you have to go down a hill. But it can still go 72 kilometers an hour, and if you do actually get up to the top speed, it maintains it. So if you go down a hill and continually drive, if you have to stop, you won't be able to reach 72 again. But yeah, it's the fact that it can even go 72. Remember, it weighs an absolute ton, which means if you can ram someone with this vehicle, boy, is it fun. Gets 490 alpha, super consistent, accuracy is not awful. Bearing in mind I am using a vertical stabilizer, which is almost a must with this vehicle to make it work 100%, 0.28 accuracy. So yeah, that's the console accuracy coming into play. Of course, I am using a ramming build with the advanced powertrain and traction system. If you want to actually play this tank, use advanced loader and maybe ventilation with stabilizers. But if you want to be like the ramming build, I would go traction system, advanced powertrain, and then spool liner. But yeah, that's for the ramming potential. In terms of actual like normal competitive normal play, then yeah, using the vertical stabilizer, advanced loader, and improved ventilation or advanced optics, that's kind of really what you want to go with this tank. Armor model wise, turret armor is just basically a big middle finger to everyone that you'll be coming up against. You can, if they're raising their gun up, hit them in the underside of the mantlet, which can be penned, but like the opportunity to do that is probably limited, but it's just something to note. The hull armor is really where you're after. You can basically pen the left and right, as we've talked about with this pike nose. It's easier to see on this view. You can see there's a prominent left and right angle that you can pen, and of course that big lower plate can be penned as well. Side armor is actually considerably easier than the 257, so you can pen it. Ideally, what you want to do is you see the area between the tracks and the hull armor. You can see it on this view. There's like a little gap between the tracks and the armor, that like blue section. I don't know if we can get it, but yeah, the bit on the right here, if you can shoot in between that, I think we may be able to actually highlight the bit in between. But yeah, it's essentially this bit. It's not the easiest thing to explain. It would be so much easier if we had a cursor on World of Tanks. But yeah, basically in between the tracks and that blue bar on the side will basically pen. And if you have high enough pen, you can pen that a bit above that. You don't want to hit the blue bar because that is the spaced armor, so just be aware of that. Alternatively, you can pen through the tracks and side armor if you're at the front, which you might want to do, but it is slightly risky to ensure a guaranteed penetration. And of course, if you get around the back, just shoot the back. Other than that, that's the IS-7, a very, very solid tier 10 heavy tank. Now then, moving forward, we then have the Object 277, but before then we have the T10. The T10 is a fantastic vehicle that I enjoyed playing. It's probably been power crept a little bit since I played it before, but it is a solid performer. It gets 440 alpha. It plays much like a heavy medium tank. It gets the speed of a heavy medium, or medium heavy. I don't know what you want to call it, but yeah, essentially it's a fast heavy tank with reduced armor comparatively to some more of the general heavy tank premise. But remember, it gets the pike nose, it gets a little bit of spaced armor. It can be a little bit of an annoyance to actually pen from the side, but yeah, in general, T10, really, really fun to play. And then you move on to the tier 10 version, which is essentially an upgraded version of the T10 itself, which is the Object 277. And the Object 277 is my favorite tier 10 heavy tank in general, I think. That is because it gets 490 alpha damage, 265 penetration. It can go 55 kilometers an hour. It's really accurate. It has hit points. It has a little bit of armor that you can bounce a few rounds. It has a good turret to a degree where maybe some people can hit the cupola, but it's quite hard for most people when you're on the move and stuff. Lower plate can be a little bit trollish because it is that boat shaped, so it's no longer just the flat hull armor, so you want to be aiming at the lowest portion of this tank to be able to pen. Some people will pen the upper plate regardless, and of course the side armor can be penned quite easily in this vehicle compared to some of the others like the 257, but yeah, generally a very, very good tank. Then it's nearly there. We're nearly there. We've got the tank destroyers, and this will be a whistle-stop tour because essentially all of them are very, very similar. Starting off at the low tier, we've got the Su-85, and this is the tier 5. It's essentially a non-turreted tank destroyer that has fast rate of fire. It doesn't really get much else. Its concealment is very, very good, so you can sit in a bush and hide, especially if you used advanced optics and advanced concealment. And use all of the camo perks. It's a little bit of a troll, but you're really after the Su-100, which is the tier 6, and this is a fantastic vehicle. You're essentially a similar sort of tank, but you get 390 alpha damage, as you can see here. Very good accuracy when fully upgraded and when using some of the kind of perks and equipment to reduce the accuracy down to a nice amount. And yeah, a really, really solid performer. Of course, staying in bushes and doing that sort of stuff, it's going to be good. Then you move on to the non-turreted tanks that have the high alpha damage, which is the Su-152. It has 152mm. It doesn't basically get any armor whatsoever, so you get penned by everything. But remember, you do 700 damage back to them, which is nice. But of course, you have to wait until you get fully upgraded to get the 390 alpha damage gun that's actually good. And of course, remember, when you take that gun, you limit the YOLO capacity, or you increase the YOLO capacity that enemies are just going to be like, well, he doesn't have the 700 alpha gun, so I'm just going to YOLO round him and basically stop him dead in your tracks, because this tank does not really turn very well at all, and it will take a full 13 seconds to fully rotate the entire way around in a 360-degree circle, so not particularly great. But yeah, in general, Su-152, it's okay. Then you lead on to the ISU-152. which is essentially an SU-152 with a little bit more armor, and it gets a way better gun because it's more accurate and has higher penetration standard and has more damage as well. So it's kind of getting into the realms of just being able to auto-pen everything that you see. And then you get the 704, which is an upgraded version of the ISU that actually has armor, so it's a bit trollish. In fact, I think that this tank may even have better armor than the 268, but essentially this is the ultimate kind of aggressive, fast, kind of tank destroyer. It's not super fast, but it can get aggressive. I mean, within the game, you can kind of come up against a lot of heavy tanks and you can pen them with the premium rounds as well. Really, really fun tank to play. And then you get the 268, which is my favourite tank destroyer in the game and why I actually went ahead and 3-marked this thing. 850 alpha, you can get 1100 with its premium rounds. It gets 395mm of heat pen, which is amazing. You can pen IS-7 turrets with that. I also use the advanced reload to swap between ammo for light tanks with the HE rounds, which do 1100, and with 90 penetration. They're fun for bat chats as well. Vision range good, still concealment good. You can even reduce it further with advanced concealment. Yeah, a really, really fun tank to play, and I did enjoy playing this tank massively. I think it's super, super competitive, and very underrated, I think, in a lot of people's eyes. Then we also have the SU-100M1, which is not a good tank. It basically gets auto-penned by everything. It's not very flexible. It gets basically no gun depression, and it's long as hell, and just, yeah, it's useless in my opinion. When you're fully upgraded, maybe you can have a good game. Probably not. To be honest. And then you get the SU-101, which is a good tank, but yet again, it suffers from having very, very limited gun depression. But as soon as you get fully upgraded with the 440 alpha damage gun that you can get on this thing, it becomes so much fun. I really enjoyed the SU-101, and it relies upon being hidden using advanced concealment and advanced optics, using the loader, and basically sitting in some bushes and absolutely farming enemy tanks. The damage per minute of this vehicle is insane for a tier 8 tank destroyer, 2,900. And that's without a commander with the rapid loading, so you're looking at probably 3,200 or something in that region. So yeah, really, really did enjoy the tier 8 SU-101 when it was fully upgraded. So I want to put that caveat in there. When it was stock, it was awful. Then you get fully into the next one, which is the SU-12254, and this tank, oh my god, this tank. This is one of my favourite tier 9 tank destroyers. It is so, so good. The alpha damage and also the reload of the tank mean that the damage per minute, 3,600 damage per minute, and it is so good. It can go 54 kilometers an hour, it's flexible, it has amazing concealment, for 219 still concealment, which is insane. And when you put a commander in it, which we will do just for the sake of showcasing what this thing can do, if we put the I don't know if I've got a fully camoed crew here. This one might be the best one, I don't know. But yeah, 200 still concealment, 499 view range, amazing pen on its heat rounds. It's just amazing. I really loved this tank. And then it gets on to the top tier 10 tanks, which are the Object 263 and the Object 268 version 4. The 263 was a very, very good tank, and I did enjoy playing this vehicle. It's one of the newest that I've unlocked, and it plays quite well. The armor model wise, basically has that big lower plate which people pen, but other than that, it's quite hard to pen unless people hit inside of the gun, which they can do if you're angling like this. They'll actually hit into the gun and pen, and also the side armor's trash, so you get penned by everyone as soon as you expose the side. Rear is terrible as well. Of course, you're an open top vehicle, so artillery love it, but other than that, 550 alpha, really, really good concealment, really good vision range, and it's a pretty aggressive, fast vehicle as well that has armor, so yeah, it's really fun to play. Then you move on to the awful tier 10, which on the World of Tanks PC, it's the Bobject, the broken object, but on World of Tanks console, it's the broken in terms of it's just terrible. Everyone pens you in this vehicle. I tried playing it thinking, maybe I can bounce a few rounds. No, you get penned by everything. It's awful. It's slow. It is sluggish. it has 650 alpha, which isn't even worth the armor that you don't actually have. It's super inflexible, 5 degrees of gun depression, not even good accuracy either. I hated this tank. I mean, some people will enjoy it, I'm sure, but yeah, me, didn't enjoy it whatsoever. Hopefully you will if you did decide to pick it up and you play it, but yeah, I think it's one of the last tanks I would recommend. And then, of course, the Piggy line, which is the artillery pieces all the way up to the 261. This entire line is very, very good. Basically, I'll give you the rundown of the entire line. I'm not going into specifics on artillery pieces, but essentially, they all have super high alpha damage. The splash range, I believe, is the highest on the Soviet vehicles off the top of my head with the HE rounds. But other than that, these are super, super scummy. And yeah, overall, I mean, they're artillery. But other than that, hopefully that's given you a good overview as to all of the Soviet tanks in the game. And hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. If you have any questions regarding any tank, then please leave them in the comments section down below. And if you know so much about World of Tanks, then please feel free to answer other people's questions, because I'm not always available 100% of the time. I do work full time. So yeah, just please help each other out, and I will try to help as many people as I can as and when I see the comments come onto this video. But hopefully you did enjoy. Don't forget, you can check out some of the other tech tree lines in this video, which are the US tech tree, which you can see on the left, and on the right hand side I will link you the full playlist to all of the tech tree guides that I've done on the channel, which go through loads of different nations, exactly the same sort of format as this video, and hopefully you'll enjoy those. Other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and you join me in one of those. Goodbye.